Low carb or low fat? Which diet is healthier? That is a question that is at least thought, if not spoken, quite commonly. And we're going to dig into this today, but we're going to dig into it from a little bit different angle. And that's the angle of which diet is healthier over the long term. And that's important because most people who try and go low carb or go low fat do it on a short-term basis. They may do it for 3 months and then stop. They've got a wedding dress to get into. They have a beach trip coming up. There's usually a vain reason, so to speak, to lose weight, trim up. And so they do whatever's sexy or popular at the moment, the low carb version or the low fat version. And both have been shown effective to help with weight loss in the short term and maybe make you appear healthier because you're losing weight. So, we're taught in our culture that skinny is healthy or skinny is better, but that's not always the case metabolically. But from a surface level, they're effective in helping you lose weight short term and quote unquote look healthier. But there haven't been long-term studies on low carb diet and or low fat diet to see are they healthy over the long term. And so we want to look at that, and then we want to look at a corollary question of what is more important, macronutrients or micronutrients? Because at least in the gym community, like CrossFit or boot camp, or maybe some of the extreme sports like ultra marathoning and things of that nature, many athletes, at least the people that I'm exposed to in the gyms, are counting their macros or counting their macronutrients, which means they're counting that if they're working with a coach or a dietitian or a nutritionist, they are on a regimented routine of eating so many carbs a day and so many fats and so many proteins. And often those people in the gym setting, at least, are not concerned with the quality of their macros. They don't care if their carbohydrate comes from a grape or an M&M. They just want to hit their carb number. And to the average person, it's pretty intuitive that there's a significant health quality difference between an M&M and a grape. And so that brings in the importance of micronutrients, where a grape clearly has more nutrition in it in the form of, say, vitamins, flavonoids, polyphenols, different nutrients like that, as opposed to the M&M, which is essentially devoid of it. It's just sugar and food colorings and dyes and things with no nutrient value or anti-nutrient value. And so obviously micronutrients are more important. But on a dietary level, again, that obviously, when I say obviously, I guess intuitively it's obvious that they're important. But from a scientific research standpoint, there hasn't been a long-term study looking at these diets and their nutrient quality and comparing them to risk of death over the long term. And so we are going to look at that today because that study has been done. The Journal of Internal Medicine here in 2023 published this study entitled Low Carbohydrate Diets, Low Fat Diets, and Mortality in Middle-Aged and Older People. And so this was a first of its kind study that looked at these diets over the long term instead of just the short term way that most clinical trials look at them. So if you see in the methods section here, this study looked at over 371,000 people aged 50 to 71 years. So they're looking at middle-aged people and the importance of these diets for mortality. And why is this important? Well, because middle age and older people is where there's more suffering, more chronic disease, and a greater opportunity for the diet to make an impact positively or negatively. And so looking at 371,000 plus 50 to 71-year-olds over a period of average 23 and a half years is a big time study. That's a long time of follow-up. And so we can see how does a low carb diet or a low fat diet over the long term impact risk of death in the middle-aged and elderly population. And so what they did was they broke it down into an unhealthy low carb diet, a long-term low carb diet, a healthy low carb diet, and the same for low fat. So long-term low fat, unhealthy low fat, healthy low fat diet. And the determinants of what was unhealthy versus healthy low carb per se is they based it on adherence of the dietary pattern. Okay, and so were they eating a low carb diet that was healthy with more fruits and veggies, say, or more processed foods, etc. So what they found was the highest quintile. So a quintile, quint is 5, right? So the top 20%, the people who ate the low carb diet for the longest and an unhealthy low carb diet had significantly higher risks of total death and cause specific death. So that would be like they know specifically what they died from, like death from cardiovascular disease or death from diabetes. Okay. So the longer you eat a low carb diet, you have an increased risk of death. And the longer you eat an unhealthy low carb diet, you have a higher risk of death. What does that mean? Well, many people are low carb, you know, but eat an unhealthy low carb diet. So they might not eat a lot of carbs, but they eat a high saturated fat ketogenic diet, say. And for some people, that's not healthy. For most people, that's not healthy over the long term. And so that would be an example of a low carb diet that's unhealthy over the long term. On the opposite end, a healthy low carb diet was associated with slightly lower total death. Okay. The highest quintile of a healthy low fat diet was associated with significantly lower death from all causes, 18%, 16% lower heart disease deaths, and 18% lower cancer deaths. So the highest quality low fat diet was 18% decreased risk of death from all causes compared to the lowest quality low fat diet. Notably, isocaloric replacement of 3% of energy of saturated fat with other macronutrient types was associated with significantly lower total and cause-specific mortality. What does that mean? Well, these authors looked at, well, what if we put someone on a low-fat diet, okay, and now the fat that they are eating, what if we take 3% of that they're eating as saturated fat and we replace that with a protein or carb? And what they found was doing that significantly lowered risk of death from all causes and cause specific. So essentially that's pulling out saturated fat as the most damaging part of that diet. And so if you can replace saturated fat calories with some other macronutrient or unsaturated fat, it's going to be protective. For low quality carbohydrates, death was significantly reduced after replacement with plant protein and unsaturated fat. So they did that same thing in the low carb diet. Instead of eating, unhealthy carbs in your low carb diet, if you replace those processed unhealthy carbs, say, with a plant protein or an unsaturated fat, calorie for calorie, again, that lowers your risk of death. So this study concluded higher death rate was observed for long-term low carb diet and unhealthy low carb diet, but slightly lower risks for a healthy low carb diet. What they concluded was that the healthiest diet was maintaining a healthy low fat diet with less saturated fat, and that prevents all-cause death and cause-specific death in middle and older age people. So, if we tease that out and we can go look at this editorial now, that shows us that it's the saturated fat in the animal products that were the largest determinants of death risk. And so this editorial is written about this study. And I couldn't get access to the full text of this study, so unfortunately all we have is the abstract, but this editorial does a good job at teasing things out for us. And so what they're saying is the study by Zhao et al., which you can see up here. Zhao is the first author. This is new evidence supporting the importance of diet quality in preventing premature deaths. Carbohydrate and fat qualities are known to be a key determinant of health outcomes in the context of both low and high carb intake. The effect of a low carbohydrate diet versus the effect of a low fat diet was looked at by Zhao and his authors. And the role of diet quality in these diets has not been sufficiently addressed in other trials. So like I said, this was the first study to look at a long-term study of those diets and to look at the quality. Now there's clear evidence that diet quality is a key determinant of health outcomes. So again, grape versus M&M, apple versus donut, right? The fiber-rich carbs from the apple is going to be much healthier than the sugar carbs from the donut. And so it's pretty intuitive, but of course, they have to publish it in a research journal before they get behind it, I guess. Okay. It should be emphasized that diet quality should be satisfactory for both low carb and low fat diet and without extreme high or low intake of carbohydrates. Not all low fat diets may be beneficial, especially if they increase the amount of refined carbohydrates and sugars instead of the preferred fiber-rich high quality carbs. So again, if you go on a low fat diet, but you're eating, M&Ms and not grapes, you might not be healthier because of that, right? Evidence from long-term observational studies in the general populations indicate that low and high intake of carbohydrates are associated with greater premature death. Importantly, carbohydrate and fat qualities were not taken into account in those studies. So what they're saying is you may be able to do a low or high carb diet if the quality of the carbs is taken into effect. That hasn't been studied, so we don't know yet. But essentially, what we have research on is if you're eating low carb, so less than 40% of your total calories, or high carb, more than 70% of your total calories, both of those are associated with increased premature death. So this most recent study, is of high interest and supports a favorable role of diet quality in both low carb and low fat diets. The low carb and low fat dietary patterns were defined as healthy or unhealthy based on dietary quality score, which took into account different types of carbohydrate-rich foods, saturated and unsaturated fats, plants, and animal-based protein. Overall, the results suggest more favorable associations between low fat and low carb and death at healthier versions of both diets. Thus, higher quality of both diets was a consistent determinant of better survival. Intuitive. If the dietary patterns of the low carb and low fat contained more healthy food sources of carbohydrates, fats, and proteins, typically from plant-based foods, the mortality risk was reduced compared to dietary patterns of low carb and low fat that contained more saturated fat, more refined low quality carbs, and more animal-based proteins. And in the red here, it's what we've said. These results are of clear interest, but not completely novel, right? There's been some studies to lead us this way, but again, if you're just the average human being, it's pretty intuitive, apple or donut, right? Grape or M&M. But again, has to be published so you can point to it in the literature before they're going to shout it from the mountaintops, and they still won't because there's food industry lobbyists stopping them. But anyway, plant-based low-carb diets were associated with lower death, whereas an animal-based low-carb diet instead was associated with increased death. So again, right there, two people eating low-carb diets, one plant-based, one animal-based. The plant-based person is protected from early death. The animal-based has a higher risk of early death. So that suggests the animal food, something about the animal food is increasing risk. And again, what they found was it's the saturated fat component being a major driver there. The associations of low carb and low fat with death seem to depend on the quality and food sources of macronutrients. It is worth noting that both diets were associated with lower death if the dietary pattern was healthy with high diet quality. Although the healthy low-fat diet showed a greater death reduction than the healthy low-carb diet. So the healthy low-fat diet protected lower death risk by 18%. The healthy low-carb diet only reduced it by 5%. So, over 3 times more protection by eating a healthy low-fat diet than a healthy low-carb diet. This new finding suggests that it may be even more important to have high diet quality if you're adhering to a low-carb diet rather than a low-fat diet. That is, a more plant-based low-carb diet, low in saturated fat. And we talked about them substituting, calorie for calorie, substituting, carbs or protein for saturated fat. And they say again here, by making that substitution of just 3% of energy from saturated fat with another macronutrient like a carb or a protein, that lowered death risk. And replacing low quality carbohydrates with unsaturated fat and protein was also associated with reduced death risk. So if you replace your saturated fat with protein or quality carb, you're going to reduce your risk. And if you're eating bad forms of carbs like refined carbs and you change that for like a plant protein or an unsaturated fat like flaxseed, chia, something like that, avocado oil, walnuts, you're reducing your risk of death. This highlights the importance of dietary fat quality, and the partial replacement of saturated fat with unsaturated fat could contribute to reduced risk. Let's speed this up here for you. Dietary guidelines worldwide recommend high-quality diets in which the foods appear more important than the relative amounts of the total macronutrients. So again, there's that macro-micro consideration. It's what's the quality of the food versus the total number of macronutrients you're getting from it, okay? Grapes are going to be healthier than M&Ms, even though there's more macros in the M&Ms, all right? Successful prevention of premature deaths in the general population is partly dependent on the consumption of high-quality foods with adequate quality fat, protein, and carbs. The results also suggest that individuals and patients may need clear guidance when choosing to adhere to a low-carb or low-fat diet. In purple, clearly, it is time to communicate diets in terms of diet and food quality rather than merely of quantity or composition of total macronutrients. Okay, this is something that I've taught for years, functional medicine's taught for years, many doctors for decades and hundreds of years have even taught. So again, it's intuitive to us, it's quality over quantity, but again, it has to be published in the research before they're going to say, well, who said that? Where's the proof, right? But you've known this all along, and this is research just to support that. It's like apple or donut, grape or M&M. It's about quality, not quantity. And that's what we've talked about in recent weeks, is it's more important to get the nutrients than it is to get the macros, so to speak. We get way too many macros in the United States, as we've talked about. We're an obese, malnourished country, so we get plenty of carbs, protein, fats, but not plenty of nutrition from those carb, protein, fats. We need to tip the scales the other way and get more nutrients, less macros. So they conclude with, for the low carb diet, it may be particularly important to choose plant-based foods, including vegetable fats and proteins, to ensure protection. So again, wrapping it up, this was, again, pretty intuitive, but it's great to see it starting to be investigated in the research. And it's important for this to get to mainstream patient knowledge, because again, people often follow the fads, whatever the current low carb fad is or the low fat fad is. And they do it oftentimes more to lose weight and look good on the beach or something. But some people latch on, lose weight, and feel better with it, and then stay on it for years. But this research suggests that that could actually be shortening their life instead of extending it, where they might think they're extending it because they're eating low carb or low fat over the long term. But if there's not the right quality in that low fat diet, they're shortening their life. And even if they've got good quality low carb diet, if you're doing low carb for too long, that could shorten your life. So they conclude the best, most healthy diet would be a low fat, plant-based diet. So let's open it up.
What about the carnivore diet?
Yeah, that would not score well on this. So the carnivore diet is all animal, right? And all saturated fat, or largely saturated fat. And so and study after study of health and mortality risk, The more animal-based foods you eat, the worse the outcomes. And so a book I've talked about recently called How Not to Age by Michael Greger. He goes in depth in that, so much so that it's swung how I've been eating for the last month. And I'm someone who I did the carnivore diet. I only lasted 2 days because I lost too much weight too fast. Last I guess it'd be 2 Novembers ago now. But I was someone who always said I could live on meat. I would like I could give up vegetables. I don't want to give up meat. But in reading Dr. Greger's book and looking at the research that he cites over 8,000 studies in that book. uh, How Not to Age is the title again. It's very convincing, the importance of not eating too much of the meat stuff, and it's not he's totally plant based. I do not eat meat, but I was, as I shared last week, I was eating too much. Like the meat was taking up too much of my plate, whereas the fruits and veggies and plant-based stuff was more like the side dish or the garnish. And so the last 4 weeks, I've really shrunk down the size of my plate that the meat takes up and expanded the whole uh, plant food section of my plate. And I shared last week, I've noticed a big difference in my stool quality. Um, I never thought I had energy issues, but as I think back about it, my energy is better. I still feel great in the gym, even though I've eaten drastically less meat than I've eaten in the last 20 years. So it's individualized. There's I know patients with autoimmune disease and Crohn's disease and different diseases where the carnivore diet has been life-changing for them. But the jury's still out in terms of long term. We don't have any studies like this one yet that's followed them for 24 years. And so I think it needs to be, again, individualized. And it's kind of like if you're going to take a supplement or a drug, there should be informed consent and benefits, risks, and alternatives considered.
Right. The reason I asked is because my husband's doing the carnivore diet and he feels a lot better, but he's been doing it for about probably a month and a half, maybe 2 months. And he feels like a lot better, but he's extremely tired lately.
Yeah. Yeah. So, what I could say is there's a lot of people that have done the ketogenic diet and felt that as well. But the ketogenic diet was, invented basically for epilepsy patients and for neurologic patients with neurologic issues and disorders. And so the ketogenic diet, like a strict keto diet, isn't healthy to do over the long term. That should only be done, couple months, and then you go back to a modified keto or back to a balanced diet. So people who don't have epilepsy or some other neurological disease that requires it, if they're just doing it for health and to lose weight over the long term, that's probably going to work against them. And that may be the case with carnivore as well. So if he did it and he felt great and he's starting to notice diminishing returns as time goes, it may be time to work back some of the plant-based foods and maybe even shift back to a balance and see how he does there, and then maybe shift to more of a plant dominance from there. So I can give another anecdote for a family member who recently had high cholesterol come back. His LDL was over 200, and the doctor wanted to put him on statins. And he called me and he said, "Hey, they want to put me on statins, and I know you don't like those. What should I do?" And so I was sharing with him what I was reading about the plant-based stuff and the animal research and all that. And so he's been going more plant-based, and he cut red meat out, and he cut red meat out for 2 weeks, and he said this is the best he's felt in his whole life. And then his wife went on vacation, and she had bought some without him. She was traveling without him, and so she bought ground beef and cooked it up so he and his kids could eat it for dinner. And he ate it for a couple days at different meals, and he said he he had symptomatology come back where he was like, wow, I'm not feeling as awesome as I felt the last 2 weeks. Excuse me. So for him, that was an experience that, hey, the red meat is impacting me, and oh, the saturated fat for the red meat may be contributing to his lipid findings. And so removing that red meat, increasing the plants, eating more white meat instead of red meat, on the retest of his lipid panel may show, hey, it's really helped under the hood as well.